We are so glad you joined us today to get centered, but we have a disclaimer. Being centered really is more of an aspiration than a destination. This is a vodcast where we'll be discussing all things mind and body, mental health, physical well-being, parenting, marriage, healthy touch, anger and how to handle it. What is integrative medicine? How do I meditate? What are we learning from COVID in this quarantine experience? Where do we go from here? You have questions on these topics, and we ask those same questions ourselves. So this isn't a vodcast full of answers. It's one full of discussion, because we're going to tell you right now we do not have all the answers, but we do love a rich discussion and hope you do too. We're Leila Scott and John Price, the founders of the Center for Healing Arts and Sciences, and this vodcast is hosted by our amazing team, which is comprised of an integrative group of therapists offering individual, couples, family, depth therapy, and offers support groups for men, women, teens, young professionals, and others. Chinese medicine practitioners offering acupuncture, herbal medicine, food therapy, lifestyle advice, and last but not least, our mindfulness meditation and spirituality guide. Be sure to reach out to us to let us know other topics you'd like to hear us discuss, or to let us know if you'd like to work with our integrative team. We are here for you and offering virtual care as well as home delivery of wellness self-care packages during this time of physical separation. Give us a shout at 713-526-4444 and be sure to follow us on social at Center for HAS. And now, please enjoy the show.
Well, hey folks, welcome back to Get Centered. Welcome to all of you here today who are participating on this call, and then thank you for those of you that are watching and listening. I'm excited to further this conversation with a friend. Ken Gayle is here with us. He's a teacher of mine. He's a vocal teacher and many other things. I would say a teacher of spirituality and philosophy as well, because the vocal exercises turn very quickly into depth psychology, spirituality, identity, and the like. So thanks for joining us as we kind of mine through this territory and talk about identity in particular, and then let's see where we go. So why don't you spend some time and introduce yourself, and then you'll get some questions from us along the way.
Awesome. A pleasure to be here. Thanks, John. And I'm glad we get to kind of expand on our conversation we've had before. And I think your topic of identity is appropriate, especially as I'm trying to introduce myself. As you mentioned, I teach voice. I'm trained as an opera singer, but I've worked in nonprofit world and fundraising. I have a degree in applied voice in music. Actually, full disclosure on the musical side of things, my friend Rodney Waters is also a musical colleague. We've had a chance to collaborate a number of times, which has been a beautiful thing. And how else to describe myself? Maybe we'll dive right into our identity conversation, because I'm a man, I'm Black, I'm gay. I'm also the first generation kid of immigrants. Both of my parents, neither of my parents are from the States. My mother is from Panama, and my father is from Jamaica, which is kind of an interesting combination. And they both met in school at the University of Washington in Seattle. So I'm originally from the Northwest, and have been in Houston for about 16 or 17 years. And I continue to sing. For a number of years, I was one of those gypsy opera singers who travels and sings all over the place. And there was a cast member of a show called Three Mode Tenors for a number of years, which was kind of an interesting, looking back at it, it was kind of an interesting show about how identity impacts lives. Because it was a take on the three tenors phenomenon, but it was through the lens of, it was a show built to highlight the work of three African-American tenors or Black tenors. And it was kind of an interesting way of using music and art to entertain people, but also educate to a degree. I guess that may be enough of my personal introduction.
I want to note something first. I just had this idea that with your permission, what we will be doing is at the end of this episode, we will include one of your songs.
Oh my, okay.
All right. If you're good with that, and
Absolutely.
so listen to the very end, and feel honored to listen to Ken sing.
Awesome.
Well,
what next?
Yeah, what next is that I think, I mean, it's cool because you and I met because Rodney was like, you got to meet this guy, and he's going to help you with your voice. And what then happens is that I realized that vocal lessons are more, I think, of a kind of yoga, and it's also a spiritual exercise. We talk about finding your voice. Well, that's the literal and in a metaphorical sense. When you're finding your voice, you're trying to figure out how you express something and how you most fully express something that's real and authentic, and unaffected. And it's not as easy as one would think. And so it makes sense to me that kind of you and I would talk about both vocal and then jump off into whether I'm feeling vulnerable because I'm making a mistake or something, and that triggers something that comes out, and you and I chat about it. It's really this question about, here we are in Pride Month and talking about sexuality. We're also, the world is recognizing the systemic issues around racism and police brutality, and how policies get enacted kind of downstream, where they might have decent intentions, but the way that they actually play themselves out is harmful, and how we need to take a look at that. So there's a lot of, whether it's your blackness or your gayness or your manness or your spirituality or your depth, I think any of those points would be important. But like what I said earlier is that I'm a white male, and when it comes to identity, it's not, you don't have to push up against as much. When I work with gay men, it's this constant question of, who am I? How do I gesture? How do I walk? How do I communicate? Who can I love? Who can I, is that look communicate something undesirable? Do I need to keep that to myself? And it's a keeping in of genuine expression of self. And of course there are really negative consequences to that, but also one of the good consequences of that is that because one has to really bump up against that, one really becomes more grounded in who they are. And I'm wondering if does that resonate? Is that your life? How does that play out in your world?
That's actually a really good point. And you're right, there's a point of wrestling with identity, or with perceived identity, that is really, it kind of builds muscle, for lack of a better analogy, in terms of you get really clearer about who you actually are.
Yeah.
Staying in the realm of sexuality, and for a lot of people who may be of an older generation for whom being gay was more of an issue, there's a struggle oftentimes around coming to terms with what it means to acknowledge being gay, because there are a lot of expectations putting on the maleness role of what is expected of a man and what it means to be a man. For many people is very limited. And I guess for people who've gone through the process of, who are not straight and have come to terms with their sexuality in ways that are healthy, they are able to recognize that there is no one definition of what it means to be, in the case of a gay man, a man. And then the next ripple out actually is there's no one way of being human. And the fullness of that is something that we can continue to explore. And in terms of whether or not you withhold the expression of some key element of yourself, that I think is something that perhaps gay people have to wrestle with more concretely early on. But I think in my particular case, there was a layer of dealing with my own sexuality that was also happening in the context of our society writ large, which has some underlying racist philosophy, for lack of a better term, that actually tells people that you know, to be yourself fundamentally is to be flawed or to be less than. That's kind of the way that racism works. And as a child, and you know, kids, I call it, they have the really unfiltered BS detector usually, where someone says, you teach a child that wonderful things like everybody should be treated equally, or everyone is fundamentally the same, and they take you at your word until they observe your actions up against that. And so, growing up in Seattle, I actually grew up in a very multicultural, multiracial neighborhood. My next door neighbors were a Catholic family, had like 7 kids, a number of whom were adopted of different cultures. People across the street were Jewish. I grew up in religious terms as Seventh-day Adventists, which is, I jokingly call them Baptists who go to church on Saturday. Mm-hmm. And you learn within any particular denomination, each of them have their own particular lens on what the truth is, and so you'll hear adults say things like, things that could conceivably be considered anti-Catholic or anti-Semitic, or something that's something other than fully embracing love. And as a kid, because you're taught God is love, you think, okay, just love until I'm trying to love my friend, and you hear someone say that, and you kind of don't have the language to unpack it yet, so you kind of put a mental post-it note on it and keep rolling. And I kind of had that running all the time, and ultimately you start to realize that, okay, either I don't need to know what the dissonance is here, but I'm going to continue to stay in resonance until I really bump up against something that tells me no. And so the my entire growing up period, and you can always look back and biographically make it make sense, but I remember having some element of that awareness from a very young age that there's what people say is okay versus what feels fundamentally true at core. And as a young child, thankfully, I joke that my mother was a really good model of being contrary in the best way. She would listen and nod to things that people would say that didn't really have any direct effect on her and do what she had to do. And so I kind of took that on, like, okay, if I don't really understand this, but I'll just keep being good and move forward. And so, moving back to your original question, expressing yourself fully and without filter was kind of something that I just learned and lived, interestingly enough, until I actually originally came out to my mother. I told her that she actually asked me when I was about 18 and 19 if I was gay, and I think I'd been coming to terms with that myself, and was kind of hoping that she would finally ask me, and I told her, well, yes, I am. And her first response was, well, if you come home with AIDS, I'm not burying you. Which was like, who are you and what have you done with my mother? Kind of moment. And long story short, she, over the course of about a month of conversation around that, she came to admit that she said, I've known you were gay from a very, very young age. I know from the age of, she said 7 or 8, which made me kind of go, how did you know this? Or what did you know? But she recognized that this was my truth very early on. And she personally said that I had to go through the process of kind of grieving the loss of my idea of what I wanted for you. And so I apologize for those words were really hurtful, but this I realized was your truth fundamentally, which felt validating in a way, but it also felt fully in resonance with the way that I had lived my life up to that point. And so I'm not sure if I've answered your question directly, but what I also came to recognize is that, excuse me, being in full resonance with your truth allows you to express all the more and more layers of yourself, but also to resonate with more and more layers of other people. And oftentimes we learn to dampen that resonance, or to not even feel what that is. We're taught to shut that particular feedback loop down. I'll stop talking for a second.
You guys have any questions? I know I have a few.
Well, I want to jump in because I'm curious. And I don't know, Ken, if this is for you or just for the group in general, of what will it take to get to that better place? I know, at least in terms of that racial conflict right now, right? We're saying it shouldn't we're not talking about if you're Black or white. We're saying like we're all human, right? Like we're just people. And I think when it comes to even sexual orientation, why should it be that heterosexuality is the norm? Why do you have to come out? Why do you have to justify being gay or explain that? Oh, like kind of what you had mentioned with your mother saying, well, I had this idea for you. How do we as a human race, how do we as just compassionate, caring people get to a point where we don't have to justify, okay, well, I have to explain why I love this person, or I have to explain the color of my skin? I don't know. I struggle with that a lot, of how do we get more as a human collective to just embrace each other and not be uncomfortable about the fact that everyone is different, right? And that it's not that there's a specific subset of like, this is the standard, this is what's normal, and if you stray away from that, then there's something wrong with you.
To me, it is the self-inquiry that he was suggesting. You know, the more that we peel back the layers of ourselves and see ourselves with honest, loving eyes, you know, and maybe at first it doesn't feel loving because we discover a layer of ourselves that is unattractive, not bad or good, but, you know, like I consider myself an incredibly conscious person when it comes to race and people of other sexual orientations. But through all these conversations, I'm realizing that there's ways that I accidentally was not being as conscious as I could have. And I've been sitting with the discomfort of that. But through that discomfort, I know myself more fully, and I can be more compassionate to myself and therefore to others.
Beautiful. Those are both beautiful points, actually. And now to your point about making our common humanity the default jumping off point, it seems really, I don't know why it seems so complicated beyond that. And I don't want to sound naive about that, but that's kind of, if we can get back to one, to that point, that would be, it would propel us so much further, so much more quickly. I don't want to, there are questions of the religious/spiritual traditions that our culture holds that are sometimes not examined, that uphold those types of parsing of full humanity, or even let's start someplace so simple like original sin. The idea that to be human fundamentally is to be broken, or in a way that is that makes the discovery and the exploration and the learning process of life seem to be a punishment rather than an adventure. That's a different mental setup that takes a little bit of unpacking, which not everybody has the tools or the frame of reference to unpack. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay, I guess I'll go. I just can't help but think also, because these are such large issues, right? Just worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
It could help to consider our own personal lives, and when we are in conflict with, whether it's our partner or mother or father, anyone, the first thing that has to happen is the person who has, even if it was an accident, right, perpetrated in one way or another, been the one who hurt feelings, the first place to start is, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I was wrong, and I consider you, and I want you to feel seen, and then we can start to examine what next, right? And it feels to me like we're stuck in the reason, to speak to your point now, like, why can't we just all be one? I wish, right? And maybe we can just continue all these conversations we're having, hopefully are making baby steps toward that place. But until each one of us does the self-examination and can say, even if I did something accidentally, I'm sorry, and I want you to feel seen and consider, then can we move on?
I completely agree with that. I think part of the issue is a basic human inability to sit with paradox, and to sit with the fact that we are one is a beautiful thought and a beautiful statement, but it also, if taken too far, erases individuality. And to sit with the differences and the samenesses simultaneously, because we always want to veer to one side or another, and it's extremely labor intensive to try to be conscious enough to say that I'm constantly, all of us in this, we represent so many individual groups and cultural groups or backgrounds. We are all one, and then we get to individual families. We have very different lenses through which we see the world. And until we can start seeing the sameness and the difference simultaneously and how they creatively, again, back to John, we've had conversations about order and chaos, how those things are necessary for creativity and to interact with each other. But when we really try to make it simple on ourselves and to one way or the other, we're not going to get and to several people's point, that starts with our own look into ourselves. And the more we're able to sit with the sort of conflicting multiplicity within us, the more we have the capacity to sit with that externally.
Without a doubt. But I also want to make a clarification. And when I say I wish one, like, wouldn't that be beautiful? It's the we are all uniquely the same type of one, not let's erase the differences or pretend like there's not, really important differences. I'll just say that, right? Like, that we want to honor and appreciate. And, but I think that's just yet another paradox to hold, that all being one can also mean that we're different.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, going off of that too, because I agree, right? I think my original question is, what would it take for everyone to be as loving and caring and open-minded and understanding as us? But that's not the reality. And I'm curious how all of you kind of deal with that challenge of the people who aren't as open-minded, who aren't as willing to be introspective, who are so set in their ways and believe in God in their way and believe in their standards the right way and don't even want to step into having a conversation like this.
I want to, this is a funny, Nat, I like this question. And I had a mentor of mine who years ago said, I think I've even said this before here, if you're not convinced that you're an alcoholic, do more research. And the sad thing about this is, in this human project, we're doing a lot of research. It's just, are we learning from our research? What I think is happening is, the system as it is does not work. It's ineffective. It's effective in a lot of ways. And I shouldn't say it so. It is effective in a lot of ways, and there are some ways that it's not effective. And there are some people that it doesn't reach. And so we're getting feedback and saying, like, look, this does not work this way. And now can we make the change? Can we actually listen to each other? And I have that image of like if Leela Scott and I get into a conflict or something, there's something that holds us together. We're in a marriage, we're in a relationship. It behooves us, we're living together. We share all of our, we share everything. And so it behooves us to actually turn towards each other and say, hey, we really want to work towards this. But if I envision other people to be other, they're not held in that container. But if I envision other people to be held in that kind of universal oneness that connects us all of a sudden it behooves me to turn towards somebody and say, tell me what you're feeling and help me understand, and where have I gone wrong here? And so I do think that it is an issue of imagination, that we're actually not expanding our imagination to include, all of those folks. Like, Leela Scott and I were talking about when somebody goes to the to space and they look down on the earth and they say, holy shit, we're all on that little dot.
Yeah.
And they come home and they have these like radically expansive experiences. They become environmentalists. They become kind of transformed, more compassionate, more oriented to connecting with other people because they've had the experience of the oneness.
Or they become suicidal because, you know, they feel so small. Like, what's the point? You know, just saying that it's both, right? It's always a both and. We are so small and insignificant, and we are so meaningful. And again, it just all comes back to holding both at the same time.
I see it as, oh, Gia, go ahead.
No, you can go. You had an idea.
I'm kind of like, I think we're talking about the same thing from like the meta and then the macro or micro, I don't know what the right word is, but it's like, if I can see, there's a great practice that my teacher does every morning, and it's like, it's, what is this aliveness that I am? But then it's not just like, what is this aliveness? It's like, how is this aliveness? And then like, who is this aliveness? And so I think that when you start to like shift the lens in that way, it's like, oh man, I really don't know. Like it kind of brings the question mark back into the question, and then now I'm, instead of feeling like, oh, I'm a fixed thing and this is what I am, and it's like, well, I wonder, you know, how am I, and what am I, who am I, right? And then all of a sudden it sort of peels back the certainty, which I think we all just want, that certainty, because it upholds that kind of like ego side of things that, I mean, I don't know if y'all can jump in on this, but it's like, I want that because at least I can hold on to that. That's solid, right? And at least I know what that is. But the truth is that we're all in this kind of like, we really don't know. And we're just waiting to see in some way.
Yeah. And like, I had like a couple of collective thoughts while you guys were all kind of chiming in. And maybe you can give me specifically some advice. I've had quite a few parents in the past kind of come in, and some of my clients who are all under the age of 18 who kind of come in and then end up coming out to me in session, but are too afraid to bring it up to their parents. I'm wondering on more specifically how to empower them, but also how to empower the collective, you know, community/communities to be able to provide both parents and clients and everyone in between to really be able to kind of like, you know, come together. And I mean, maybe it's the education system that aren't addressing it, or it's parents kind of being too embarrassed or shameful or afraid or whatever else. What advice would you give to those parents and to those little kids who might be listening in?
Gotcha. Well, I know that one of the challenges oftentimes with kids or people who are under the age of 18 coming out to their parents, depending on their parents' belief systems or how open-minded they are, or if the threat of violence, which is very real in some contexts, where sometimes young, but probably your clients are probably in a possibly slightly different demographic, where the parents are probably somewhat educated, and the kids likewise. I would imagine. I would think that I guess the question is which fear is holding the person's back from expressing their truth. Does the child? I've heard sort of situations where, and it was probably a generation ago, where a parent will categorically say that I will disown you if you come out. That's one extreme. Then there are people who would put it in the context of our family religious belief says that this is an abomination, and so if this comes out, I'm going to you are dead to me. that's again another extreme. If that's not, however, what you're dealing with, then I mean, I would just advise both parents and children to remember fundamentally that they love each other at core. One of the things that that in the conversation that I had with my mother and even with my siblings after the fact was that, you know, and it's probably cliche at this point, which I'm the same person you've known all this time. This is just a piece of information that is new in that context, which is true to a degree. But then the next part is, well, and all of us, on some level, we're still our core same self. And paradoxically, we are also understanding our own evolution and understanding the layers of complexity that make us interesting and beautiful and keep us curious and engaged, because it's a continuing, I guess what even drives family relationships ideally is that people are willing to continue to explore and grow together. It's not that you're asking someone to be under glass and no longer be at their leading edge. If you can continue this idea of curiosity and growth and expansion into a more full expression of who we might be as individuals, then that, I think, feeds this other collective growth and understanding and evolution into a wider, more inclusive understanding of what it means to be human. It does start with allowing that to be the fundamental relationship that we have with ourselves. And oftentimes people feel in the coming out process that they may have to amputate that real core part of themselves because of some type of outside influence, when in actuality it's really unhealthy if we cut ourselves off from that level of honesty and self-inquiry. That's something that's a gift of the coming out process, is because it requires you to take it down to zero and say, okay, fundamentally, what is the truth of me, and can I express that? And if so, how? If not, why? That's again, trying not to make it a huge meta idea, but that's kind of what's at stake with being truthful to who we actually are as individuals. That I think is a first step before we can really move into some of these more visionary possibilities, which we all hold. But that's what the first step is, that, in my opinion. Is that helpful?
Yeah. Very.
I start running my mouth and like,
I had somebody once say, make yourself love that table.
Mm.
You just make that happen. And they were like, I can't do that. Right. Okay. So we're talking about who I am, how I love, who I love, my identity. And I want to zero in on this because I had this fantasy as you guys were talking about, like, what is it? Like, culture is something that kind of is overlaying us, that says, here's how you behave. Here are the rites of passage, norms, the ways of interacting with people. This is kind of, I shake hands this way, I look at you in the eye, or I don't, I speak this language. And I'm ready as an infant or as a developing human, I'm ready to like take that in. I'm predisposed at particular ages to learn language much faster than any other language. And so the language that I hear will be the one that I learn to speak. And so I get that part, because in culture says, this is the language that you speak, not that one. This is the religion, not that one. This is how this is how men behave, not that way. This is how women behave, so on and so forth. This is what sexuality is, yes. Okay, but then we have something inborn inside of us, like my core identity, right? And so sexuality is a core part of an identity. That's something that is here. And then how culture makes space for that will create a conflict, or not.
Or not.
And so at baseline, what we're talking about, and check me on this, because I'm really trying to rack my brain on this. What we're talking about is, do you acknowledge and consider that my core self and identity can exist? Do you make space for that? Or do you say that, God would never create that, or that doesn't exist, it's a preference, we're talking just about sexuality here, where I am right now. And so what you then have is a conflict between agendas, which is, well, my, understanding of that is that it's not core. Well, okay, then you're not really considering who I am at my core, which my core says that it is. And all of a sudden, right now, we're okay. Now you create an otherness, I have an otherness, and we're not able to connect because your fundamental beliefs are different. But where I get stuck here is that, okay, fundamentally our beliefs may be different, but all I'm asking you here is not to believe differently. I'm asking you to consider that my identity and individuality can be different from yours. And then just acknowledging that, I'm not saying for you to behave differently. Where does this, just when it comes to sexuality, where does it get into a bind as you're going through this kind of coming out process? What kind of things are you considering and thinking about and working through? I'm just interested in learning more.
Well, that's a wonderfully layered and nuanced question. And I don't know if I have a direct answer to that, but in response to what you said about how the conflict that comes up between how we perceive someone perceives their own individual core versus what a society might whose direction they may try to guide them. It also, to me, bumps up against how the experience of and the expression of love is allowed to be channeled, or what's considered appropriate channels for love, because we have this idea also of love being specifically a two-way interaction between a lover and an object of love, instead of maybe a more philosophical understanding of love as a response to one's environment, or to response to relationship, response to how we relate. And the bigger challenge, I think, is that when the federal decision around gay marriage came down, and there was the little meme was "love is love" was kept on being tossed out. And as simplistic as that sounds, there's a deeper truth that is maybe more foundational, where that we can interact with our I'm going to sound like a hippie, but you can interact with your world from a position of relation. How am I going to relate to the world in love, or am I going to relate to the world in another type of relation, in another type of interaction, which may be, if you want to put it into the lover warrior archetype language, if you want it, am I going to love the world, or am I going to conquer the world? If that's the toggle you want to play with, because if you approach your world and every interaction as a lover, then you are actually more prone to look for something fascinating. You're more receptive. You're more willing to allow yourself to be affected, to be touched, to be vulnerable. And that actually allows you to have a much more nuanced and expansive personal experience, in my opinion, in my experience, where oftentimes we're taught to position ourselves as somehow separate from our world in a way that is not that, where the world is either an adversary, or there's something where our first relationship is less than loving, and is guarded in ways that actually do not serve us, if that makes any sense. That's kind of and I feel that like in my solar plexus, there's a place that we actually do not, we shield ourselves from interacting in a way that allows love to be our reality and our primary reality. Does that make sense?
Yes. And when you were saying that the meme "love is love," I had this like flash, and it was like, you know what? I suspect, right? I'm not in anyone else's head, but somebody who is anti-gay, I would imagine, doesn't think of this as people should love who they are drawn to love, but that this is an act of sex, you know, that it's really more about the sex. And I suspect that a lot of us haven't accepted that sex, even heterosexually, is not just nothing but an animalistic part of ourselves, right? That it's actually part of our expression of love. And so many of us have a difficult relationship with it from early on. We weren't taught how to be sexual in our bodies and to be healthy sexually. And so even those marital consenting experiences can feel wrought, right? So then we have these people who haven't even accepted sex as an act of love and sharing our bodies and our hearts and our minds and our conscientiousnesses. And so then when you extrapolate that into two men or two women getting together, by God, that just must be an abomination.
Trigger. So, yeah. I don't know if that answered your question, John. But
no, Leela Scott speaks very well to the unconscious levels of what's going on, because, you know, when you're talking about, when you say belief, I believe this is wrong, I believe this is right, people want to think that that's based on their cognition and what they think, and they have thought through this, and this is what I believe. But, you know, we know as depth psychologists, there are all kinds of layers of unconscious things that are really driving the things that they then rationalize as their belief system. So that's the complicated thing of unpacking all that. And exactly like you said, Leela Scott, I mean, in the gay conversation, often it just ends up with people who are so uncomfortable with their own sexuality, they don't want that to be a part of any conversation, doesn't matter, gay or straight.
And then they kind of hide behind the policy of like, well, marriage and the laws of what that means and who gets to be included in that reality.
Right, but it's a rational justification of an unconscious motive.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to lose a couple of folks as they work with patients coming up soon. Clients, patients.
By 11 o'clock.
Thank you.
Later, y'all.
And then there were four.
Yeah. No, it is a good point, Leela Scott, because there's, you know, we kind of pick an ideology to conceal our own shadow work. You know, so I then am justified to not have to look at my issues of my own, how I understand sex in general, certainly sexuality specifically. But then I can kind of hide out in those ideological landscapes so that I don't ever have to confront it, because I'm then validated by a community that says, no, you're right. And there's a reason in the Bible for this. And there's and just to go back, Ken, to what you were saying about kind of sound like a hippie. My buddy Rudy Erasmus wrote a book called Touch, and he's a pastor downtown at St. John's, and it was all about love, and it was all about openness, and it was all about Jesus. He was saying, like, look, you know, the core message here is love, and we can look at every tradition and say that, and so when you bypass that core essence, you're getting lost in the weeds, and then you've got to be suspicious, like, what am I trying to hide out here, or what's concealed? But back to what you were saying, Rodney, the unconscious is unconscious. So pointing at somebody and saying you're doing this, you know, that's a fight, that's an argument, that's a defense, as opposed to somebody saying, oh, you're right, you know, I see where I'm doing that, you know? Which is what you were saying, Leela Scott, earlier, where you're going, I'm really being self-reflective and taking a look at what I'm carrying into all these interactions. And I thought I was this, but really I'm that. And now I get to grow from this and not still live in that, which I think is radical.
Yeah, and it's hard work. I was just gonna say it's hard work, you know, and it's like any hard work, it's work that feels really worthwhile, you know, as you make your way out of the mud, you know, into the water to rinse off, right? Like, it's just this process, got to go into the mud and come out of the mud, and go into the mud and come out of the mud. And that is a commitment that I think not everyone is willing to make with themselves. You know, it's so much more pleasant, you know, and certainly much easier to just let things be, both internally, right? Like with whatever I believe, which, like as you were saying, it's really believing something is just telling myself something is true, or letting something that somebody else has told me be true without a personal inquiry into it, you know, to see where I land. So it's difficult to convince people the same way it's difficult if somebody is, you know, noticing they're a couch potato. And, you know, it's hard to get up and move when you're comfy, you know.
I want to jump, at the risk of jumping ship. I want to throw something into the mix real quick and see what happens. But I am, Ken, interested in a couple of things. You know, not only picking up on your developmental trajectory about identity, like that thread. The other thread that I think is really important, well, there's three threads actually. The other thread is talking about how the worldwide opening that's happening currently about race and policy, where our social experiences kind of connect with our political and legislative experience, and how those things interact, and what's kind of cracking open in the world right now. So that's certainly a lane we can go into. So protest, and the other is talking about blackness from the, you know, because we have both the skin tones. Then we have a social construct and an identity. We have other things that are created out of that. And so I had this question for you earlier, which is like, when did you realize you were Black? And it's not a question saying like, when did you realize your skin was this color? It's when did you first realize, like, wait, that means something, and that carries a weight with it. So I've thrown a lot out there, and I tend to do that. But.
Gotcha. Well, let me wind the thread from the most recent question. My mom tells a story about when I was getting ready to go to elementary school, living out in Seattle, and the story is that my dad wanted me to go to this parochial school, this small parochial school called King's Garden, and my mother was not so keen on the idea of me not going to a private school in that way, and so, but she said, okay, let's go and see. And it was like preschool, at a really, really young age. And my mom took us, she said, so you go to this school, and all my worst fears were confirmed, where I opened the door and it's this like little old white woman named Mrs. Quigley, who says, oh, what a beautiful little Black baby. And it's told as a funny joke, but and Mrs. Quigley she looked like Mrs. Quigley. And this would have been, maybe 1973 or so. So the civil rights movement had begun to move. Seattle is not the most diverse place, and it was this really small subset. And at this little school, I think I was one of maybe two Black children in a rather large school. And I was at this school for a very long time. From preschool until through 6th grade, through 7th grade. And my younger sister also attended, and I had two cousins that went as well. And all the way through up to that point, if there were a total of 600 students in the entire student body, there may have been, if there were 6 Black people, that would have been the number of people who were there. And I remember just recognizing that I was Black, but not assigning a tremendous amount of difference, weight to it, because honestly, at that particular time and at that particular school, they were really self-identified as, we are a Christian community, and we are trying to express God's love in every way. And it was, but it was a little bit crazy making, because there were, I don't know how to even describe it, but I felt a little bit set apart because of the sheer rarity of people who looked like me and that I was able to interact with. And I was just doing my Ken thing. And I remember when I finally went to a public school, which was it was about 7th or 8th grade, completely opposite side of town, highly diverse, mostly Black population, being a little bit of a culture shock, and kind of going, ooh, this is a completely different frame of reference now, and in retrospect, it was probably exactly what it needed at that time, and it was also a very different economic, socioeconomic route, because it was a private school which costs money versus a public school in another part of the town. And I remember having to wrap my head around what the idea of Blackness represented, because I had not experienced, my parents weren't rich by any stretch of the imagination, but I had not experienced any type of real social or economic privation to that point. But I was suddenly surrounded with a lot of students who had a very different life experience and frame of reference and sets of expectations of the way that they thought their lives were going to unfold, their expectations of me, what they thought, who and what they thought I was, all of which was kind of interesting to try to parse as a middle school kid in Seattle, Washington at that point. So I guess that would be, so I guess maybe middle school is when I really started to really grapple with what the, some of the larger implications / expectations of what it meant to be Black. As Rodney mentioned before, neither of my parents are from the States, and so there's a first generation kid of immigrants thing, which was always also pushing just achievement and education as inherent goods, which are, but they weren't also blind to the reality of what it meant to be Black in America. I know there's a whole other conversation that's had between people of quote unquote African American experience versus people who are of immigrant experience here, where there is an understanding of the fraught racial history of this country specifically as a subset of the colonial experience, which is also interestingly similar, but culturally different in a lot of ways. And a lot of people of immigrant experience will more readily hold on to their immigrant identity than assume the African American identity, because of a lot of the stigmas that are a result of the policies and the history of race in this country. And that particular cauldron is one that continues to refine itself. And even during the civil rights movement, and looking back as an adult learning about the civil rights movement, when there was elements of Pan-Africanism, where there was an encouragement of all people of Black heritage to see a commonality that oftentimes had ties to and through the experience of colonialism that were actually helpful for maintaining a larger perspective of what it meant to really be wrestling with race in the United States specifically, and also in the world. And in those cases, it's helpful. It's heartbreaking, but it's also helpful to have that context, understand structurally what Blackness has come to mean in this culture and other cultures, and also in the broader historical scope. So having that lens has been helpful for me as well.
When you
answer a part of one of the threads.
But I'm curious about understanding what you mean by helpful. Are you talking about helpful in the sense that it kind of holds you together and it holds kind of what do you mean helpful?
Well, for me, and this is interesting that recently, it's actually been a helpful container because I can actually contextualize my experience in the lineage of my ancestors and people who I know, and my personal ancestors and the big A ancestors context of what Black people have and continue to bump up against in society at large, because it can really feel it can feel overwhelming and personal in ways that that it is and isn't. In some ways, things are so baked into the sauce currently because of the way that because of cultural history and the history of the colonial enterprise writ large, that it takes some, and it will take some unpacking. And interestingly, that some people have had the luxury of not unpacking because they were not negatively affected to that degree. So, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you talk about ancestry and just all of the little a, big A ancestry, we have to remember epigenetics, you know, so even under the best, most ideal of circumstances, if somebody were to not experience racism in their lifetime somehow, there's still that, right? There's this generations cellularly that are going to take time to move through.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, and there's a couple of years ago, I did a Father's Day event / concert for here in Houston for a group of people with Panamanian extraction. Funny enough, there's a number of people from the Canal Zone, which is the area where my mother grew up, where this is where a number of people of Korean background actually were. Give you a little bit of the history. The construction of the Panama Canal, a number of the workers who actually did the physical work of building the canal were actually were from the Caribbean, and it was not slave labor specifically, but it was there was a reach out to find labor to actually do the work of building the canal to Jamaica and other parts of the Caribbean, because there were, at the time of the construction, slavery was no longer legal, and there were issues of within Panama itself, there were some cultural clashes between Panamanians and people of African extraction who were actually in Panama. And so politically and economically, it was actually more feasible for the people who were building the canal to reach out contract workers from Jamaica, bring them in to live and work and build the canal. Things that I found out and learned as an adult after being asked to create a concert for some people actually my mother had grown up with who now lived in Panama. So the process of going through this Father's Day concert, bringing it together, and there's a whole layer of learning the ancestry of people whose experience was actually building the canal. Much of which was not known by me, but not known by the general public either. And the context of what the Panama Canal meant, and also what it meant to my mother's family and both who live in Panama today and those who don't. All of that became much more real and visceral to me in that context. And so when I talk about the ancestors, and then there's the sheer number of people who died in the building of the canal as well, and what the waters they represent. It was a really profound experience to creatively come up with a concert that was in tribute to the fathers in that context. And then also my mother was tremendously proud in that context as well, because talk about little snippets of this as I was younger, but I didn't have a context for. So things like that are what which people of African extraction carry at an epigenetic level, whether or not it's conscious, and there's beauty to be had from examining it and mining it for the gold, and also then sharing it with the general public so that the deeper context of the fraught history of race that's worldwide becomes contextualized, so that when someone says, I want you to be an anti-racist ally, they can recognize the micro and macro effect of it, so that it doesn't feel quite so, oh, I feel so useless because my reach is so small. So maybe your job is just to witness or hold space in this context while we all do this. So that's kind of what's online for me at the moment.
It brings up for me, and let me know if this jumps too far from where we are now, but it brings up for me that question I asked you earlier about what your sense is for all the people, certainly white people, and I'll just speak that, white people actually reaching out, connecting people of color, saying, let's talk, tell me what's wrong, tell me what's going on. And I know that's kind of it's another both and, because it's, from these conversations we've been having on Get Centered, it seems like there's, number one, there's a sense of like, why now? Why now? I mean, this is hundreds of years old. Like, why? Just what's the moment? And I get that. And also, I certainly understand the underlying suspicion. And I'm just wondering also your experience of, people reaching out and how you feel when people do want to have these conversations current day.
Well, actually, it's to your point. The why now is valid. However, what I'm finding is that if I'm willing to take the time to have the conversation and sort of get centered and say, this is how this affects me now, and this is the context, and my particular way of expressing myself, I tend to be pretty self-reflective, and I don't put people on blast. I'm not vomiting forth things that are unresolved necessarily in the context of those conversations, but and so I'm able to hold that in ways that I think are helpful. Not everybody can do that. And for a lot of people, that requests or those conversations can be very triggering of conscious and unconscious trauma. And so the sheer number of also additional stressors which are online at the moment also make that challenging for everybody involved in the conversation. So one of the challenges is to create a place where the conversation is more of a listening session for a period of time, and maybe even not even looking for solution, just so much as this is a place where things can be expressed as a safe container to be heard. For starters, and at which point we can begin to appreciate, sometimes in the telling of the story, you can appreciate the actual depth of meaning behind something, or even the depth of wounding that might have existed that had not been acknowledged. That process takes time to unpack and to hold. And the willingness to, again, create a container to hold that for the process. And then we talk about the language of alchemy, for things have to bubble up into awareness before you can actually apply heat to it to change the shape of it and that sort of thing. And so if we can just hold the container for a little bit longer and be willing to be uncomfortable with that for a while, and be willing to feel viscerally what comes up from hearing that, and also and to be able to not shy away from that, and be able to even reflect, like say, hey, that sucks, or I had no idea, or that I feel that in the back of my neck too. My God, how is that possible? Now, how can then to ask the questions of what can we do to begin the process of rebuilding clear conversation and trust now, that's not so freighted with that layer of expectation or trauma, so that the white person asking the question is not representing something that they don't represent. So they're not a proxy for who or whatever caused them pain in the past, because so they're not the trigger. And I think for I have a girlfriend who's doing something this month, specifically helping a woman who goes to my church, and she's specifically doing 30 days in the month of June of being how to be an ally for this is notes for white people for how to be a good ally. And she talks about her whole process of having to awaken to some of these uncomfortable truths, and to hold the discomfort, and to recognize that actually she's not fragile, and that these are things that the process is uncomfortable, and this is what the growth process is like. And it's just her own notes on these are my experiences, here's some suggestions. And I think she's really doing a beautiful job of being transparent about this is how difficult this is. This is not easy, and it's my work to do. And it might be helpful for somebody else to have, to recognize that it ain't going to be easy, and that it's necessary, and it's an expression of love, because you're trying to build a relationship on honest communication and with these higher ideals going forward. Not to say that there are not structural issues, and that's not the column of what we need to do politically yet, but this is what needs to happen before we can actually inform really intelligent and substantive political and policy change, is that trigger around the idea of racism and the epithet of racist being such a trigger for some people can be diffused. So we can kind of go, well, we grew up in this society that is fundamentally racist and at its structural core, so we can't expect to be anything other than we've been affected by that, or have some overlay of that in our thought process. So say recognize that so we can move forward. Is that helpful?
Oh yeah. Yeah. It is. It addresses that issue that there is something really important about getting the identity out of it. We talk about the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt being, it's a behavior. Shame is an identity issue. One is I've done something bad. The other is I am bad. And part of what unfortunately happens when we're unconscious is that there's an economy of mind. We want to just group somebody into like, this is what you are. So you are a racist, or you are a this. And there certainly are people that live that identity out. They live a racist identity out, and they do horrendous things as a result. For most of us, what ends up happening is we have certain structures that are relics of a racist human tendency. I can't, we other people. And so, and they tend to get lumped into these general categories like sexuality, race, male, female, all these really large questions, and then they play themselves out on the microcosm. And so saying, I finally feel like this is I know there's something that we can do right now because we can address policy. And I like that. That's what Professor Kendi's doing such an amazing job of addressing. Like, there are systemic and policy issues that are here. We don't have to find you're hating people or you're ignorant. because nobody's going to say, oh, I'm a fucking idiot. What can I say? Our psyche defends against those kinds of issues, of kind of looking at ourselves in that way. I can, however, say, shit, there is something that is inside of me that is as a result of my development, maybe even my direct experience, and I have been unconscious of how that affects other people and how I cut people off from their sense of humanness, from our human connection. And that's a wound, and that hurts. But if I'm the problem, if the totality of who I am is the problem, I'm now a shameful person, and I actually do all the shit that we don't want people to do. When I've got a massive shame core, I behave in ways that are not only unconscious but harmful to myself and others. If it's something inside of me that I can identify, it's a behavior or a policy. That's on a collective level, that's behavior, right? Policy is behavior. On an individual level, my behavior can change, so I can take a look at that and actually address it. I love you saying it that way. So I had a nice insight just then. Thank you.
And I think we have to be so careful to not hate the hater, right? Like, whether that's somebody who's gay if you're straight, somebody who is anti-gay if you're gay, like if somebody thinks politically differently than I do, they might hate on me, but it doesn't do the world any good if I hate them back.
No doubt. That's what Nelson Mandela taught.
Mm-hmm. It's sort of counterintuitive because maybe the human response is to want to shield and protect and oftentimes lash out, but maintaining some sense of permeability that's the hard work, because you have to that you can't. I know myself that I begin to implode if I keep the shields up, and it takes a tremendous amount of physical effort to maintain the impermeability that actually hurts.
Right. I want to be conscientious of time, and for 4 minutes, I'm just curious about like slender threads. What's hanging out that and I get it, plenty, but what's on your minds that we need to connect with to feel resolved in our conversation today?
Mm-hmm.
I think one way to think about identity is this: it's a constant realization of who we are and who we're not. Often, like when I'm so much like the first half of life stuff is really all the value in finding out who we're not. And that finding out who we're not is a process of finding out who we are. And we're talking about identity within these subgroups. I belong in a certain sense, but I'm not the same as everyone in that group. And those, really nuanced layers of connection and individuality and sameness and difference. And we've been saying today that it has to happen on an inner and an outer level. And it's a constant, everyday sort of healthy vigilance of an awareness of my interpreting things, how what's being projected on me that is me or is not me, And that's another reason I think this conversation is so helpful, because it's not simply, the white folks calling their black friend to say, how can we fix this? It's how can we all have a deeper understanding of what identity really is and how that relates to our lives and our closest families, and how that ripples out into the collective ever, we go about doing that. If we're a more private person, do this, or for someone who gets involved with politics, that. But it's essentially the same. And that's that sort of sameness, that big umbrella is the complex identity that we all struggle with.
I had this visual while you're talking about that, like of just, if this is the whole of everyone, right? Everyone is in this wholeness, that I came here and have been expressed in this way. You came here and got expressed as you, and each of us, right? But that even though, yes, I have to figure out what I'm not, that the next level, like you're saying in the second half of life, is to realize that I'm not that, but I can't be this unless you're that.
Mm. And to appreciate that, fully, and to your point about a healthy, and what it requires is this sort of healthy vigilance, and I would even use the term curiosity, where you stay engaged, so that you, because it's also so, it's not fixed, and our tendency is to go towards fixity. I know I find it myself, where it's like, okay, now that I know who I am, we're done. No. Continue to see who you become, or what version of you shows up in the context of this relationship. What elements of you come to the fore in this type of situation, if you are aware that this is what you're doing now. If versus the flip side of it is like, I don't recognize myself in this. What happened? I suddenly feel like I'm a different person. You can find ways to sort of surf that out and stay curious about that.
Anything else? I know we could go for a long time here, but
we could. Thank you so much for asking me to be part of the conversation. The timing was actually right on point, so thank you.
And thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
Let me be your eyes, and I will lead you through this darkest night, blindly seeking only to be understood, and all the while a light is shining bright and good. Just look and you will see. Let me be your eyes, and I will set you free. Let me be your hands, and I will lift this burden that you carry, grasping tightly, holding on to what you know does not compare to what is there when you let go. Just feel the cool release. Let me be your hand, and I will bring you peace. Let me be your heart, and you will surely understand that I am here in you, and you are here in me. And though sometimes it seems you don't have much, I promise you that what you have will always be enough. Let me be your heart, and I will show you love. Let me be your breath, and you will feel the earth and sky move through. Moment into moment, born anew, and then softly, gently die.